I still don't know why I'm telling you this, but maybe it's because the years have finally caught up with me and I can't carry it anymore. I worked as a police officer in Colorado for most of my career, later as an investigator in the sheriff's office of Chaffee County. I saw plenty of things: domestic disputes that went bad, tragic car accidents along Highway 285, hikers who didn't make it back alive from the collegiate peaks. But there's one case from the winter of 1993 that never left me. I've tried to write it off as exhaustion or misperception, but every time I drive past the Sawatch Range, the memory comes back like it happened yesterday. January 11th, 1993. That date is burned into my head. A call came into the office from the small town of Buena Vista, right off Highway 24, not far from Cottonwood Pass. A local lodge owner reported that one of his seasonal staff, a young man from Kansas named Eric Turner, hadn't returned from a short hike the previous afternoon. The weather had been erratic: sun in the morning, then a sudden snow squall by evening. At first, it seemed like the kind of thing we dealt with often, a flatlander underestimating the mountains. Still, something in the lodge owner's tone made me take it seriously. He said Eric wasn't the type to wander off or miss a shift, and more unsettling, the man's boots and jacket were still in his cabin. That detail made no sense if he'd gone for a walk in the cold. I remember standing in the cramped office on East Main Street in Buena Vista, the old wood stove clicking as it heated up, the dispatcher sliding me the incident sheet. "You'll want to talk to Tom Alvarez, too," she said. Tom was a veteran search and rescue volunteer, the kind of guy who knew every trail and gulch in the county. He'd already been up near Cottonwood Pass that morning and noticed tracks in the snow that seemed to stop dead in a place where they shouldn't have. That caught my attention. In those mountains, tracks don't just stop. They blow over. They circle back. They fade out gradually, but they don't just vanish. If you've never been in the Sawatch Range in January, it's hard to describe. The mountains are taller and heavier than they look on postcards, shoulders of rock and pine pressing down on the valleys. The snow doesn't fall softly there. It piles, crusts, and reshapes the land until familiar trails are swallowed whole. Old stories cling to those ridges too, tales passed down from ranchers, miners, and the Ute people long before them. Some of the older deputies used to joke about the whispers in the trees when we drove up Cottonwood late at night, but they'd always get quiet when the radio static kicked in, like they knew the jokes only went so far. I never put much stock in legends back then. I was a cop. I dealt in facts. But that case would challenge everything I thought I knew about facts. I met with Tom Alvarez near the trailhead that afternoon. The air was sharp, the kind that cuts into your lungs, and the sun kept slipping in and out of low clouds, throwing the ridge lines in and out of shadow. He showed me the tracks, a set of boot prints leading off the main trail and angling toward a stand of lodgepole pines. They were crisp, unbroken, like they'd been made just the day before. But about 30 yards in, they stopped. No sign of a fall, no slide marks, no backtracking. Just one last boot print, and then nothing but untouched snow stretching out in every direction. I crouched down, brushed my glove over the surface. It wasn't windblown. It wasn't melted. It was as if the guy had stepped into thin air. We searched the immediate area, calling Eric's name until our voices bounced back off the trees. The wind picked up as dusk approached, carrying that dry, powdery snow that stings the eyes. Tom muttered that we should call it until morning. I agreed, though uneasily. I went back into town and interviewed the lodge owner. He insisted again that Eric hadn't been himself in the days leading up to his disappearance. He'd been jumpy, saying he heard someone knocking on his cabin door at night, though no one had been there when he checked. The other staff brushed it off as mountain nerves. People from flat states sometimes get rattled by the isolation and the sounds the forest makes at night. But the owner swore Eric looked genuinely scared. I noted it down, though at the time I didn't know what to do with it. That night, lying in the motel room across from the Arkansas River, I couldn't sleep. The wind rattled the windows, and every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that last boot print in the snow. A grown man doesn't just vanish 30 yards into the trees. I told myself the snow must have covered more tracks we hadn't seen, or maybe he'd veered off onto rocks where prints don't hold. But deep down, even then, I knew there was something wrong about it. I'd been in law enforcement long enough to recognize when a detail doesn't add up, and in this case, nothing did. That was the start of it, the first night of a case that would haunt me for decades. And if you stick with me, I'll tell you what we found, or maybe what found us, in those mountains. The next morning, January 12th, I was back up near Cottonwood Pass with Tom Alvarez and 3 other volunteers from Chaffee County Search and Rescue. The temperature had dropped into the single digits overnight, the kind of cold that makes every breath feel metallic, and the snowpack was brittle under our boots. We started again at the place where the tracks ended. It still made no sense. I'd expected the overnight winds to soften the prints or blow them out entirely, but instead they looked preserved, sharp, almost frozen in time. We spread out in a line, sweeping the area methodically, calling Eric's name. No response. No echo this time either, which was strange because sound usually bounced clean off those ridges. After about an hour, one of the volunteers signaled us over. He'd found something caught in the lower branches of a pine about 20 yards uphill. It was a knit cap, faded blue, with a Kansas Jayhawks logo stitched on the front. The lodge owner later confirmed it belonged to Eric. The odd part was that it was wedged too high for someone his height to have brushed past naturally, almost like it had been placed there deliberately. We pressed on, fanning deeper into the stand of trees. The silence was thick, broken only by the crunch of our boots. Around mid-morning, the batteries in my handheld radio began to fail. That wasn't unusual in cold weather, but when I swapped in fresh ones from my pack, they died within minutes too. Tom said his was acting the same. The volunteers joked nervously about the mountain not wanting us there, but I could see the unease behind their smiles. We turned back around noon and regrouped at the trailhead, the sky already shifting toward another storm. Driving back into Buena Vista, I felt the first prick of real dread. In missing person cases, the first 48 hours are critical, and Eric's window was closing fast. That evening, I interviewed 2 more of the lodge staff. Both admitted hearing odd noises in the nights before Eric vanished. One described what sounded like wood knocking near the cabins, steady and rhythmic. The other said she heard someone whispering her name outside her window, though when she looked there was only snow falling. She'd laughed it off at the time, but retelling it in the station lobby, she started shaking so hard I had to pause the interview. I wrote it all down even though I knew the sheriff wouldn't want whispers in an official report. We went out again on the 13th with dogs brought in from neighboring Fremont County. The handlers were confident at first, but their optimism drained when the dogs balked near the same patch of pines where the tracks stopped. They circled, whined, and refused to move forward, something I'd never seen trained animals do before. The handlers looked embarrassed, muttering about wind shifts, but one admitted under his breath he couldn't explain it. That night a blizzard rolled in, dumping nearly 2 feet of snow across the pass and making further search impossible for days. I stayed in Buena Vista during the storm, holed up in the same motel across from the Arkansas River. The wind howled so fiercely that the walls creaked, and once, around 3 a.m., I swear I heard 3 sharp knocks at the door. I pulled it open immediately, expecting maybe Tom or another deputy, but the walkway outside was empty and the snow was untouched. I stood there shivering, feeling the wind cut across my face, realizing there were no footprints leading up to my door. By the 15th, when the roads cleared enough, I went back up the mountain alone. I told myself I just wanted to see the search area again before the snow buried everything. But in truth, I felt pulled back, like I hadn't finished what I started. The forest was muffled under the fresh powder, every branch sagging under weight, and the world was so quiet it felt staged. When I reached the spot where the tracks had ended days before, I found something that stopped me cold. A tree about 10 feet tall had been stripped of its bark in long vertical gashes, the wood beneath pale and raw. The marks were too high for an animal like a deer, and they didn't match claw patterns from a bear or mountain lion. They looked almost like fingers had dragged down the trunk. I photographed it with the disposable camera I carried back then, though later the pictures came out blurry, the detail lost in a wash of glare. Standing there, I felt watched in a way I can't put into words. Every instinct screamed at me to leave. I trudged back to my truck, my boots sinking deep, and when I turned the ignition, the radio crackled alive with static. Through the hiss, I heard what sounded like a voice, faint and urgent, repeating my name. I yanked the handset up, demanded a repeat, but the line went dead. Back in town, I didn't tell anyone about that. Cops don't admit to hearing voices and static. It eats away at credibility. Instead, I filed my report with the bare facts and left out the parts that made my stomach turn. But that night, I couldn't sleep again. I kept replaying the whispers the staff had mentioned, the cat placed too high in the branches, the dogs refusing to enter the trees. None of it added up, and yet together it painted a picture I didn't want to face. By then I knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary missing persons case. Something else was in those mountains, and whatever it wasn't finished with us. By January 16th, the snow had eased just enough for a small team to resume a more serious search around Cottonwood Pass. Tom Alvarez and I were joined by 2 deputies from Chaffee County, a K-9 handler, and a volunteer tracker from Leadville. We moved cautiously, aware that Eric's window for survival was closing. The mountains were deceptive. What looked like a gentle slope could hide sheer drops or hidden crevices beneath the snow. Around midday, we reached a narrow canyon called Deer Gulch, about half a mile from where Eric had last been seen. The walls were sheer, coated in ice, and shadows pooled at odd angles where sunlight never penetrated. That's when we noticed it. More tracks, faint and irregular, leading down into a narrow ravine. The prints weren't consistent. They appeared to shift size and depth as if the person had been stumbling, or worse, being pulled. The dogs hesitated at the top, whimpering and pulling back despite being highly trained. I felt my pulse spike. The temperature dropped even further as clouds rolled in, and an unnatural silence settled over the gulch. No birds, no wind, just the faint crunch of our boots and the echo of distant rocks shifting. I followed the trail carefully, sliding my gloved hand along the icy rock walls. Then I saw the first sign of something that made me stop cold. Etched into the snow and ice along the canyon wall were long streaks of red, faint, almost invisible at first, smeared in a way that suggested someone had tried to climb or pull themselves upward. My stomach churned. It wasn't enough to tell whether it was blood or some kind of rust-colored residue, but the implications were clear. We pressed on slowly. Around 2 o'clock, we came upon a small overhang partially hidden by snow and fallen pine branches. There was a makeshift cairn of rocks and debris, almost like someone had been trying to create a shelter or signal. Inside, half buried under snow, was Eric's backpack. Everything else, the jacket, extra clothing, water bottle, was gone. I felt a tight knot in my chest. How do you explain this? There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints leading away from the cairn. Just emptiness, and the feeling that the walls themselves were watching. I climbed higher along a narrow ledge, and that's when I saw movement, or I thought I did. Out of the corner of my eye, a shadow shifted against the far wall. I called out, but there was no answer. Just a whisper of wind, or maybe it was a whisper that felt like wind. I froze, knowing my voice alone could carry across the canyon. Then I heard it, a faint, guttural sound, like someone, or something, exhaling slowly through a constricted throat. The deputies behind me went pale. The tracker whispered, "We shouldn't be here." I wanted to argue, but instinct told me he was right. We continued only a few yards before the sound repeated, this time closer, coming from the same shadowed area. The dogs panicked, barking and straining against their leashes. I realized then that whatever Eric had encountered had stayed close, even as days passed and snow had covered the landscape. We saw something else then. On a narrow ledge across from the cairn, small handprints had been pressed into the snow, upright and perfectly spaced, as if someone had tried to balance while climbing or hanging. The size didn't match Eric's. They were smaller, elongated, but unmistakably human in shape. I snapped photos, though later, when I looked at the negatives, the prints appeared blurred and distorted, as if something in the light refused to be captured. By the late afternoon, clouds closed in and visibility dropped. We had no choice but to retreat down the gulch. Before leaving, I took one last glance toward the overhang. The snow had shifted subtly, almost as if it had been brushed away. I couldn't explain it. We left with only Eric's backpack and those photographs, and by nightfall the storm had returned, heavy and relentless. 4 days after, we attempted aerial surveys and grid searches, but nothing else turned up. There were no tracks, no footprints, no signs of him anywhere. The locals began whispering again about the old legends, of travelers who vanished into the Sawatch Mountains, of the watchers who follow you in silence, and of the voices that sometimes call your name on windless nights. I didn't believe in any of it, and yet standing on that ledge, looking at the handprints and the shifting snow, I couldn't dismiss the possibility that something beyond explanation had intersected with Eric's path. Weeks turned into months, and the official report was closed as lost in the wilderness, but the unease never left me. Every time I drove past Cottonwood, I felt eyes on me, and I often returned to the photographs to convince myself I hadn't imagined the prints. Years later, I shared the story quietly with colleagues and friends. Some laughed, some went pale. None offered an explanation. I still have the images tucked away in a box labeled 1993, Turner. Sometimes at night, when the wind rises off the mountains and rattles the windows, I swear I can hear faint knocks or the hiss of static on a radio repeating my name. And even now, decades later, I wonder if Eric ever made it out at all, or if the mountains simply didn't want him to leave. I never stopped thinking about that winter in 1993. After the official search was called off, life in Buena Vista slowly returned to normal, but for me, nothing felt normal again. I kept my badge for a few more years, but the Turner case haunted every quiet moment, every drive past Cottonwood Pass. I would find myself lingering at the edges of those mountains on routine patrols, glancing into stands of lodgepole pine, half expecting to see a shadow move where none should be. Over time, the physical evidence, the backpack, the photographs of the handprints, the marks on the tree trunk, became more than just clues. They became symbols of something I couldn't define. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself Eric had fallen, that the strange handprints and red streaks were natural phenomena, that the sounds on the radio were just the mountain's acoustics playing tricks on my ears. But deep down, I knew those explanations didn't fit. Years later, I returned to Buena Vista during a quiet spring. Cottonwood Pass had melted back into green and brown, trails that were once icy now soft with thawed snow, but the forest seemed different somehow. Thicker, quieter, and colder in ways that had nothing to do with weather. I hiked part of the route where Eric had disappeared, alone this time, carrying only my camera and a small pack. At the old overhang where the cairn had been, I noticed a faint depression in the soil, nearly invisible, shaped almost like a footprint but too large, too elongated, to be human. I knelt and touched it, my fingers brushing against cold dirt, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I could hear the whisper again, calling my name softly, insistent yet distant. I shivered and pulled my gloves tighter. That's when it hit me. Some things in those mountains aren't meant to be found, and some people aren't meant to return. After that hike, I stopped trying to piece it together. I closed my personal notes, boxed the photographs, and placed them in a drawer I rarely opened. The story became a silent companion, one I carried with me whenever the mountains were near, especially in winter, when snow blanketed the ridges and muffled sound in ways that made the world feel unreal. I retired from law enforcement a few years later, settling in a small town along the Arkansas River, not far from Buena Vista, yet far enough that I didn't have to see the mountains every day. Still, on certain nights, when the wind howled and rattled the windows, I could swear I heard 3 sharp knocks or the faint sound of a voice carried on the snow-laden air. I never told my family, and few colleagues know the full story, partly because I feared ridicule and partly because some experiences are too heavy to share. I often wonder what Eric Turner experienced in those final hours, whether he realized he was lost to the mountains, or if something watched him the entire time. And I wonder if those handprints, the streaks of red, the whispers, were warnings or invitations. Legends in the Sawatch Range speak of the unseen, of travelers swallowed quietly, of the mountains keeping their own secrets. For years I dismissed them, but now I understand they weren't stories. They were echoes, fragments of truths too strange and too terrible for most to believe. I live my life carefully, avoiding the trails in deep winter, and I never hike Cottonwood Pass alone. But the memory lingers in subtle ways. The way shadows shift in the trees, the way snow seems to settle unnaturally on certain branches, the way a quiet hush falls over the landscape even when no wind blows. Every so often I dig out Eric's photographs and stare at the handprints, the gashes on the trees, and the overhang where his backpack rested. I have no answers, no closure, only a deep, unshakable sense that something in those mountains remains awake, watching, waiting. And I confess, with the honesty that comes only after decades, that I feel a quiet fear every time I think of him, a fear that he didn't just vanish by accident, that the mountains took him for reasons I'll never understand. The Sawatch Range holds more than snow and rock. It holds silence, it holds secrets, and it holds the weight of those who were lost. Sometimes I imagine walking the trails again, searching for Eric Turner, calling his name, hoping for a sign. But I don't. I can't. Because the mountains do not give up what they've claimed, and some mysteries are not meant to be solved. All I can do is remember and warn and accept that part of my life. The part that began on January 11th, 1993, will always belong to those mountains, to the unseen watchers, and to the boy from Kansas who never returned. Even now, decades later, when snow falls heavy and wind carries down the ridges, I feel it in my bones. Cottonwood Pass still remembers him, and in some way, it remembers me too.